Number 7, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Why has he changed his pre-election commitment not to deploy New Zealand Special Forces to Iraq to his post-election statement that deployment is, quote, definitely an option, unquote?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, this is a rapidly evolving issue, and countries including New Zealand are having to consider the issue as it intensifies. The increasing threats from ISIS and the global response will require New Zealand to carefully consider this issue. Therefore, officials are preparing advice for ministers and cabinet to consider on a range of options, including humanitarian, diplomatic and military contributions. I'd stress no decisions have been taken at this time. As members know, my least preferred option is to deploy the SAS, but I expect it to be part of the range of options. Over the last few months, countries around the world have been considering their contributions to the coalition to combat ISIL, and New Zealand shares the international community's outrage at its brutal actions. We've seen clear evidence of what this group is capable of doing.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Question, Honourable Phil Goff.
When he said on the 16th of June, without any qualification, that he ruled out New Zealand Special Forces being deployed to Iraq, even in an advisory capacity, he said, where in that assurance did he warn New Zealanders that straight after the election, suddenly sending Special Forces to Iraq was definitely an option?
Mr Speaker.
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, for a start off, I've made it very, very clear. Well, let me make it clear. That was the best information and advice I had at the time, and I believed it to be correct at the time. What I can say is the issue is evolving. I stand by the view I've said is that sending the SAS is the least preferred option of the government. But as I said when I've been asked these questions, the government will get a range of options presented to it. We don't pick and choose those options that are presented to us. We pick and choose the options we ultimately want to deploy.
Supplementary question,
Mr Speaker, when he told the country last week that the New Zealand Chief of Defence Force was attending just a regular meeting in Washington, is he telling the House that neither the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Defence or Foreign Affairs had informed him that President Obama would be addressing that meeting, and the specific purpose of that meeting was to map out a strategy of military commitments to that war, when that was in the International News Service's wires 12 hours before he made that outrageous comment?
Right, Mr Speaker, Prime Minister.
Well, it's only outrageous if it's incorrect. And, Mr Speaker, it was absolutely correct. We were not aware that President Obama was going down to speak to the meeting and taking the White House press corps with him. That's been confirmed by the Chief of Defence.
Mr Speaker, supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Honourable Phil Goff.
Why does he believe that Western-led military intervention to remove ISIS will be more successful than Western-led military intervention to remove oppressive regimes in Iraq in 2003 and Libya in 2011, both of which he supported and both of which were spectacularly unsuccessful with disastrous unintended consequences?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, firstly, I think it won't be hopefully lost on the member, given his previous roles, of the differences between the situation in Iraq today and then. In 2003, there was a situation where there was action taken to oust a regime, whatever one thinks of that. That was the view that was taken against a regime that was believed to be oppressive. The current situation is quite different in Iraq. It's one where the Iraqi government is actually asking both the United States, I think, and countries from around the world to give them support against ISIS. ISIS is an organisation that we have designated as a terrorist group. ISIS is an organisation that I believe presents both international, regional and domestic threats. It may be extremely convenient or easy for the member to be in opposition and to not care about the responsibilities that I have as Prime Minister, but I'm not going to walk away from those responsibilities. And I think that member should himself be very, very careful indeed about the claims that he makes, because I can assure the member the actions I'll be taking are with those with the best interests of New Zealanders, even if he can afford the luxury of not doing so.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Honourable Phil Goff.
Why does it make sense for New Zealand to be part of a so-called coalition of the willing of 22 military countries represented at the meeting in Washington, and to make a decision to put the lives of New Zealand soldiers at risk when two members of that coalition of the willing, NATO ally Turkey and American ally Saudi Arabia, have both supported ISIS, and Saudi Arabia, in fact, is the major provider of weaponry and funding to the ISIS terrorists.
Right, Honourable
Speaker,
Prime Minister.
Well, it's not the Saudi royal family that is in that position. There may be individual people who live in Saudi Arabia who happen to believe, well, there may be people, well, if the member's aware of what Saudi Arabia is doing, then he'll also be aware that they gave $500 million of aid, humanitarian aid, and are seriously considering what their next steps might be to combat ISIS. But they can't rule out that there are individual people who live in Saudi Arabia who happen to believe in the particular form of Islamic faith that ISIS is following. But I go back to the original point, Mr Speaker. In the end, the government will consider what is in the best interests of New Zealanders. The government will act to do the right thing by New Zealanders, even if he, as the spokesman for the opposition, chooses to ignore what's the right thing for New Zealanders.
Question number 8, Simon O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Order. I've called Simon. Order. I've called Simon O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister of Health. Is he confident